got started doing advertising work and did the Dr. Ben Casey comic strip, concurrent with the TV show, and was told, strips are a dying medium, so we went to the next dying medium, comic books, and got started did some work at Archie Comics before getting hired by DC Comics, where he rapidly became the cover artist under Carmine Infantino as the art director, who recognized Neal as the breath of fresh air art that he was looking for to revitalize the company as they were having their luncheon by Rising Marvel Comics. So Neal did a number of covers before he got put on things like World's Finest and then The Brave and the Bold. When things soured a little bit at DC, he branched over to Marvel, where of course he did his celebrated runs on X-Men and the Avengers with Roy Thomas. Back at DC, Julie Schwartz kept being Neal Adams guy on Batman, is the Brave and Bold. So we paired Denny O'Neil and Detective 395, Secret of the Waiting Graves, and a very fruitful collaboration began where both Neal and Denny, even though they were diametrically opposed on the political spectrum, collaborated incredibly well on storytelling, and the Batman and Green Lantern stories, of course, have become incredibly celebrated. Then Neal did an interesting thing. He pretty much stopped doing regular monthly comic book material to open up Continuity Associates with Victor Dono, which became a training generation of talent. A lot of people were getting their toes in the business and gravitated to Neal's, which was like the equivalent of a literary salon, I would suppose, where people would come and get Neal's tutelage, who would also put them to work so we would get some practical opportunities in both advertising or working on material for DC and Marvel. So that's where the Krusty Bunkers credit came from. Whoever was in the office that day could be pages or backgrounds or whatever. And during the 70s, Neal became an incredible advocate for creators' rights and improved production values in comics. Best known of that, of course, is championing the return of artwork to the talent, and then followed with the Siegel and Schuster, getting back in some accommodation in DC Comics, which led to them receiving credit after all these years and receiving annual annuities. Neal, through Continuity, started his own publishing line in Fits and Starts, but again, gave us characters like Bucky O'Hare, and he gave opportunities to people like Larry Hama and Mike Golden, which were incredibly fruitful for these guys. And Neal continued to remain a critic of the field, a critic of publishing practices, pushing for better. His storytelling evolved, his art style changed, continued to get more sophisticated in some eyes, and he returned to writing and drawing miniseries for DC, did the Fantastic Four project with Mark Waid, and continued to contribute stories with his beloved characters, still working right up until his passing this spring. So I want to make sure we touch on Neal the teacher, tutor, and advocate on top of his master storyteller. Gentlemen, what do you want to say about Neal?
Well, I was up at Continuity. I was up at Continuity at the time that Neal was first starting it up, and the Krusty Bunkers were formed, basically to help Alan Weiss, who was the world's worst deadline maker, finish off his 5-page Pellucidar story every month that was always proved to be too much for him to do. It's hard to minimize just what an impact he had on that industry at that point. People like Howard Chaykin, Alan Weiss, there's just so many. Mike Nasser went through there. Joe Rubenstein came out of there. Many more that I'm not forgetting.
And it was writers, not just artists. I mean, Gary Boudreau and Gary Bates.
Gary Bates lived up there.
Yeah.
Continuity, yes. And there was a spell where you couldn't get a comic book group of comic book people together where Neal didn't eventually become the center of conversation, even if he was nowhere in sight, because he had such an impact on the industry at the time. I came in on a sort of a different track. You take a look at my artwork and see that Neal wasn't one of my major influences, but I did run space up there for a while, and you know, I always liked Neal, and I'm a very good friend with his son Joel right now out in LA. You forgot to mention he had a comic book shop out in LA.
I'm not perfect.
That's well, we're going to take points off.
Sorry.
Well, I don't have any sort of direct memories. I didn't meet Neal until I was already working in comics for quite a long time. My first encounter with Neal through his work was when I was 13 years old and seeing the first issue of X-Men they did, and just couldn't believe how amazing it was. I couldn't believe that a human being could draw like that. It was a bit like I was Jake Blues at the back of the church being hit by the beam of sunlight from God and saying, you know, there's a mission. Yeah, I was just completely obsessed with Neal Adams for a very long time when I was a kid, because he seemed to bridge so many different styles, and his abilities, well, there were so many other artists like Jim Starlin and Don Newton who had got some elements of Neal's work. So when I started doing Batman, I was imitating Jim Starlin and Don Newton without realizing I was imitating Neal, because I'd never seen Neal's Batman until after I'd been working in comics for some time. Just because the town where I lived in Middle England, we didn't get that work. But it's one of the aspects that I think is so important about Neal, is that so many different artists took one element of what Neal was doing and made their whole career out of it. It was like Neal could do everything. It sort of permeated. As you look at it, you don't think they were influenced by Neal. The whole industry was influenced by him. It's just not that obvious sometimes.
And beyond that, Neal's influence through Continuity Associates in the commercial work was impactful in advertising, both printed and filmed advertising. To talk about that would be his daughter, Kris.
Thank God he showed up. Sorry we were late, we just had to wait for somebody to watch our booth.
Oh, we take after Dad.
That's true. So this is Zeea Adams, the youngest daughter of Neal Adams. I'm Kris Adams, the oldest daughter of Neal Adams. So,
You want to talk about Continuity's commercial
well,
side?
I wanted to say there is something that Neal cannot draw now. It's cats.
It never stopped before.
It's cats. Whenever we got a commercial for like Meow Mix or something like that, I'd be like, oh my God, we're gonna be drawing cats. And cats was one weakness of Neal Adams.
Well, he was still drawing when he was in the hospital, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Yeah, Neal did, I guess, the last time into the hospital.
Yeah, because I was up at, you know, Crusty Bunkers out in LA, and all that stuff was coming into
Right.
gold, so I've seen it, I was like, guy's sick.
Right.
Really?
Now, Neal was a machine. Neal loved to draw. So, you know, he drew constantly. That's the way he wanted to be. I repped Neal for, it seems like a million years now, and I could not find enough work for Neal. You know, it was always like, well, go get more, and go get more, and go get more. So, and in repping Neal, he had such an array of different, always like repping 10 different people. So it's going to be hard to fill the void of Neal Adams that comes new. And Zeea does a lot of, she draws, first of all, she colored a lot of Neal Adams' work. She has kind of followed Corey Adams, who is Zea's mother. And she also, our mother.
She's yours
I
too.
know. And she also does a lot of the editorial production that we were doing at one time at Continuity.
Yes, so, yeah, it was interesting because I started off, you know, we all started off, you know, at Continuity either next to Dad or next to Mom. And we have two brothers between us.
Right.
And as they were older, they sort of hung with Dad, so I was like, okay, Dad's only got 2 legs to sit on, so I'm gonna go sit with Mom and color. But you know, there was a lot of Dad influence on Mom's color, so there was a lot of Dad influence on my color. I actually worked for somebody who shall remain nameless that went You color like your dad. I'm like, you say that like it's a bad thing. Yeah, I mean, and we've also been asked, you know, is it genetic or is it environmental? And I really couldn't tell you, because if you're surrounded by so many brilliant artists that have come through continuity and, you know, would come to Thanksgiving dinner for us because they didn't have anywhere else to go, or
Yeah, we always had an open home.
Yeah,
So we were like wayward home for
I got invited
artists.
to one of those.
Right, Jim has been to the house, he has had either roast beef dinner or turkey dinner, I would guess.
And then we wrestled afterwards.
And we wrestled
Oh,
that,
really?
right?
That's right.
Right, I just told Zeea about the wrestling matches yesterday, and she was like, no way, you were wrestling like Howard? And I was like, yeah, I wrestled Chaykin almost every Saturday. It was like 50-50, there were
You probably
times.
beat him most of the time, didn't you?
No, there was one time I beat him, but other times, but that's how we grew up. You know, it was a very artsy household,
Yeah,
and
surgeon
everybody.
was not likely gonna happen in our family.
Right, thank God Mom was a good cook, otherwise
Yeah.
nobody would come. You weren't coming for Neal, you were really coming for Mom's cooking,
Oh,
right?
I love Thor.
Exactly, so we have a very open policy, whether it's the studio. Jim has enjoyed the comic store recently, because Neal has it is a small building. I don't want to make it sound like, oh, we have a building in LA, but we have a small building in LA, and Neal
About half the
decided-
size of this room, I'd say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we turned it into a comic store, because that was really one of the last things that Neal really wanted to have, was a comic store to keep comics moving and being part of it, and he loved having a comic store. And his main goal was to always have art books for everybody in that store. That's all he cared about, was like, Kris, you have these art books in the store. So we were always fighting to find art books for the store. So that's kind of continuity. We do anything, everything.
And it was a revolving door for artists.
You know,
You know,
a lot of people come through the.
if comic book work got slow, they would turn up in continuity, there'd be plenty of advertising work to do.
Nice.
So nobody had to go hungry.
I know that a lot of people wound up in continuity and went on to careers in comics. Is the same set for people who started in continuity and went on into commercial work?
Neal never, like we had, there's very few employees at Continuity, it's very much freelance. And Neal's goal was to actually get you out the door. Neal never wanted to like keep people, it was always like Zeea said, a revolving door.
That's a
Only
very
the
smart
family was the only thing that stuck, really, through the years. And his goal was to get everybody out, and everybody who came through left with the abilities to go out and get work. And a lot of them, you know, we have the guy who basically runs the Sesame Street photo stuff, like that's what he does now for a living. And his name is Louis Mitchell, and he came in, he actually was an assistant to Howard Chaykin
Oh, okay.
for a while, and then he came to Continuity, and he, you know, did a lot of storyboard and advertising work, and now he is the head, like, designer, photographer of the Sesame Street stuff that's out there that we see all the time in magazines and stuff, so all kinds have come through.
You know, you talked about the coloring. It reminds me of a story. I talked about Neal pushing for the better looks of the books. When Neal was doing his work at DC, when it was about the time he was on Brave and the Bold, he had whoever was coloring those stories, and they were uncredited at the time, so I don't know who they were. But he was saying, why aren't you using the 50% tone? And he said something about it being expensive, or you know, DC didn't want us using. Let me back up. Back in the day, you had 25% tones, 50% tones, and 100% tones, and you mixed and matched. You had 64 colors on a grid that you would pick and choose for how you colored your comics. What Neal discovered was that Chemical Color in Bridgeport, Connecticut, that was doing the color separations for the majority of the comic publishers, if not all of them, was giving Marvel a break on the pricing, which is why DC kept saying it was expensive, and Neal convinced Joe Orlando and Dick Giordano, when they were editors at the time, you gotta change that. Worked on Jack Adler, the production director, to get that 50% tone back into the palette.
Correct.
And that changed the look. So you can, if you look at Neal's brave and bold coloring versus before that, I think it was Ross Andrew and Mike Esposito doing brave and bold. You can see the coloring changes dramatically because that's Neal's influence right there.
Right, well, Neal would always go into production. Like every time we were up there, my dad would say, and I'd be like, okay, 10 more minutes. 3 hours later, we would finally be leaving because he would actually go into the production room, start grabbing other people's jobs, and start recoloring. And he'd be like, Jack, give me this job. I want to fix it. So he would sit there and color other people's jobs, color his own jobs. But he was always pushing everybody at TC and Marvel.
Totally.
That was his job, obviously, in the industry, was to push it along, to make paper better, coloring better, everything better. So, and we are better.
And unfortunately, he passed that along because I walk around and I see pieces, sometimes I'm like, God, I want to fix that.
Yeah, they put us across from Anthony Snyder's booth, so we're seeing like tons of art, and Zea's sitting there going, give me that piece, I need to recolor it. So I'm like, God, they're always doing it.
We did a 3-volume collection of Neal's Batman stories, Batman Illustrated by Neal Adams, and Neal did new covers and somehow convinced Paul Levitz to let him go in and re-ink some of the pages because he didn't like how he inked them or Dick inked them back in the day. And so he would remark them up, and did Corey do the coloring?
Corey did the coloring.
So Corey recolored all of those stories. And again, you compare to the original printing versus what you've got. And even though he pushed the brave and bold coloring in 1968, back then it was 2002, it was just a dramatic shift.
Right. Well, he felt that he wanted his stuff not to get stuck in time, and there were enough reprints of it that also had been recolored by other people.
Mm-hmm.
So we had stepped away from the original coloring.
Right.
And like I said, Neal wanted to update his work but still keep the flavor of it. So he wanted to then recolor for the Batman Illustrated books, and that's how we got there.
And that's why they're still in print, apparently.
Yes, exactly.
As artists, was Neal's coloring, you talked about his line work and all, but was his coloring at all influential to you guys?
Yes, especially he introduced a lot of night scene work that we hadn't seen before. Aside from being an innovator, Neal was also an instructor. Everyone who worked out at Continuity came out of there better artists for it. Some folks, his portfolio reviews were notoriously raw. Anyone who has ever heard of anyone who's gone through one, they either gave up or they pushed on harder and became all the better artists for it. But he
Well, he was honest. A lot of editors go, well, I don't have anything, you're not good enough yet. So as much as yes, the horror of the Neal Adams portfolio reviews are there, Neal was the most honest to get you work. Everybody tells the story about Frank Miller coming to Continuity, and when Frank first came, I was a receptionist at that time, when Frank portfolio, and Neal ate him up. And he's like standing there and the elevator wasn't coming fast enough. And I just remember like handing tissues as he went into the elevator. And then he came back. I was like, oh my God, this guy's back. So I went up front to my dad, and I said, that guy, he's kind of tall and spindly. And I said, he's back. And I said, can you look at his stuff again? I was like, oh no. And Frank went up there and he had improved. And also had gotten
Yeah,
so, there you go.
Your dad's abrasiveness sometimes was like the best stimulator.
Right, it's like the bad dad.
I got an Avengers job after your dad's run. And I was up at Continuity and I said, hey, Neal, I'm going to be doing the Unissued Adventures. And he looked at me and went, you're not good enough. I went, well, I'm going to have to work all that much harder on this one.
He had a way of figuring out how to motivate you. For me particularly, he would go, yeah, so if you can't do it, I'll take care of it. I'm like, don't tell me I can't do it.
Exactly.
That's the way to get me to do something, tell me I can't. It's
So
not
Alan,
happening.
how did you make it with being in England and not under Neal Adams? Like, how did you get here?
Well, I've often said before when I hear these horror stories of Neil and people, he was nothing but nice to me from the first time that I met him. And I've got nothing to contribute to this horror stories. I just see him as being someone that was incredibly supportive, and I was glad that he was a nice person because I love the world so much. I'd have been destroyed if he didn't. Happy to play.
And aside from, I mean, we're talking some of the harder things with Neal, but if you had a problem, or if there was a charity that needed work, or a cause that needed champion, Neal was always there. He was the first one into the breach. So,
Yeah, I mean, when you came to me with Heroes for Hunt for us,
yeah,
I stepped right in, yeah, so that got everybody else on board. It helped.
Right. Neal and Continuity also housed a lot of artists that could not get work in the industry. I mean, we've gone from, what's interesting is that we've gone from older artists who maybe are not getting work in comics anymore, now can do a convention every week and sit there and do commissions for you lovely people. And you were keeping them alive. You were putting money in their pockets for them to go home and take care of their wives or their grandchildren and stuff like that. Before we had conventions almost every weekend, when you lost work at DC or Marvel, which were the only two at the time, basically, then you were out. Like, now what am I supposed to do? I can't get work, I'm not in tight with any editors anymore. They would always come up to Neal. Neal would always have continuity, there was always a commercial job, sit down, you're gonna pencil. And we became like the housing of the older artists. Like, we've had Jack Sparling and Wood Mortimer and Bill Droud and Tex Blaisdell, and a lot of the older guys that like came and did a lot of commercial work for us. So Neal was always there to help everybody.
And flip side to how brutal Neal could be, when you were ready, he'd call Joe Orlando or Dick or whoever at DC and go, these guys are ready,
Right.
give them a job.
Right.
Sometimes he'd take them to DC
Yeah.
and say, here, Julie, give him something. And you know, so he was that kind of an advocate too.
Right. Saved writers like Len and Marv. I was there the day that Len and
Oh,
Marv got
tell
in
the story.
trouble.
Yeah.
And you know, Neal, there was an autograph machine room up at DC. It was like the size of a closet. And somehow everybody, because I remember always being squished under Dad's drawing board. I don't know what Len and Marv did, but like their heads were being hunted. And they came running into the room, and my dad was like, what are we gonna do? And my dad goes across the hall to Julie's room, and all I hear is yelling coming out of this room, and Len and Marv were in the autograph room with me, shedding a brick. And basically Neal comes out and he goes, okay, I'm gonna save you guys. And basically saved them.
For those that are unfamiliar, they had written a Teen Titans story that had racial components to it. And the editors flipped out going, we can't sell this in the South, we got to spike the story, it's terrible. And Neal went to bat for Len and Marv, saying, no, the story has some integrity to it. I will step in and help them replot what the objectionable parts are, so we can salvage this.
I mean, could you imagine DC without Len and Marv as writers? That day could have been the end of Len and Marv.
What year was that?
68, 69?
Wow.
Yeah, that's the
I was
very
little.
beginning of Len and Marv's writing career for DC at the time. So they were getting a job here, a job there, nothing regular yet. So around that time, DC started doing these 100-page super spectaculars. And the third one of the bunch was World's Greatest Superheroes with Neal's great wraparound, the faded, dark characters behind the spotlight. Very first time I got to visit the DC offices, I was given a tour, and there's Neal at the drafting table doing that cover. This is the first time I met him. And you know, I'm just staring in awe. He's sitting in this austere room. It's just him and the drawing table, I think, and not even a window. And he's just
That's
drawing
the
away.
closet, that's the
Oh,
other-
that was it? Okay. And you know, he's just drawing this amazing thing, and there was no reference. He just knew it all. He was just drawing away, and he would chat with me. He was a pencil a little bit, and then I moved on. And like a couple months later, the book comes out, and whoa!
Yeah. It was always nice to watch work go through and see it finished.
Sure. You got a story?
Oh, shit. I wasn't there.
You got any stories? That
He has a lot
Neal's
of-
characters and
Alan
his
has a
work?
lot of dinner stories with Neal.
Oh, yes.
Mostly where Neal was trying to convince him to do the stock market and stuff like that.
No, it wasn't the stock market. What effectively, I didn't charge for sketches. In Britain, we didn't do that. So Neal would say that, well, basically, say how stupid it was to do the work and not take the pay that I was due. And then when I did start charging for sketches, I wasn't charging enough. And there was one convention, I think it was in Chicago, where I was in the process of doing a sketch, and the guy was watching what I was working on, the guy that I was doing the sketch for, and Neal came, and I could see the rest of the people queued behind this guy, backing away. And this guy was suddenly on his own between me and Neal, and Neal said, "How much you pay for that?" And the guy said, "How much?" And he said, "Do you think that's enough? Do you not think you're insulting him? Do you not think that's worth more?" And this guy was shrinking. And Neal just had him there and he said to me, "You should be charging more," and walked away. So that's my story.
Meals with Neal were always kind of interesting at these conventions, because he would go on about things that you would never have thought he would have gone on about, like salt and pepper shakers. He could do 15 minutes.
Oh, he wrote a 5-page letter on how to butter toast to a hotel that he stayed at once.
And at least twice I saw him trying to get them to quarter the scallops, to cook them the way he wanted them. And then the chefs would never go wrong with them.
Yeah. Now, we always like refused to eat with them for fear that we'd upset somebody in the kitchen and we would all get sick. So it was like, nah, I'm not going out to dinner with Dad tonight.
Yeah. Breakfast was
He's gonna
at the
upset
con were always
somebody.
good, because whatever he was eating, there would be a dissertation on it.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Neal knew what he liked.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any stories or anecdotes about when he helped create or created Ray Shovel or Man Bat or any of the big Batman villains that are part of Batman iconic? Kind of like really embedded in Batman now?
Well, Man-Bat was the product of Frank Robbins, the writer. And he and Julie Schwartz had been plotting the story while Neal happened to be in the office that day. And he liked what he heard, and as I recall, he volunteered to draw the story and help come up with the name Man-Bat as, you know, the opposite.
Actually, not
No?
the way it went down.
How'd it go?
It went down in that Neal actually created Man Bat from whole cloth. And I can show you royalty statements now. Basically, yes, I can.
I'm not arguing.
Basically, it was a character that Neal, actually, he drew it on the side of his desk. Neal always, or most artists, will put a piece of one ply on your desk so that your desk doesn't get dirty, because they play with ink and pencils all day. And so Neal had a piece of one ply on the side of his desk in the Bronx, which is where we live. He drew a little Man Bat, and then came up with the story for Man Bat. Came into Julie, I think it was Julie, it was usually Julie.
It was Julie.
Presented it to Julie, and then basically handed off the
Okay.
storyline to
Frank
Frank
Robbins.
Robbins, right?
And I will say, Dad always said it was Ra's al Ghul. He never went with the race.
Right. Ra's al Ghul, I wasn't around, like that I can't say how that went down.
Legend has it, Benny and Julie were talking about taking the Batman stories in a more international direction. And they needed a new villain. And between Julie, Denny, and Neal created this character. And then, as you know, his daughter Talia had been introduced weeks earlier in Detective that Bob Brown drew, but I gather Neal did the basic design for her.
Yeah,
Well, she was drawn, I think she was drawn even before Dad got to her.
Well, Bob
I
Brown
think- right.
drew it in that first story, but
Right.
2 weeks later, Batman 232 comes out, she's there, so
Right.
I
The
believe he designed it.
exotic long tall
Yeah.
that everybody fell in love with.
And his dad would tell me that Batman is initially intended to be a detective, detective comics. So Ra's al Ghul was intended to be the Moriarty to
Mhm.
his.
Right, that's why he was always referred to as the detective.
Yeah.
And then he picked up on that. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
In the back, all the way.
and if I'm not mistaken, I think Neal Adams also did some of the artwork for Marvel in the early 1970s, I think with the Avengers story?
He did the Kree Skrull War storyline.
Yeah, and I think he also did some artwork on Captain Marvel.
Well, that was part of the Avengers thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he did not draw any individual issues of Captain Marvel.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, so lay people, I think, can say, like, well, we can appreciate Neal Adams and how different he was from his contemporaries when he first, as tremendous artists in their own right, could help us understand what set his art apart from his contemporaries when he first burst onto the scene. What was it that drew everyone's attention to him? And, you know, besides like the most certain superficial qualities, are there things that artists could appreciate that maybe the rest of us might not?
Well, when Neal came in, Marvel was ascending, Jack Kirby and DC Comics had been kind of this quiet thing. If you look back at the artwork at that point, pre-Neal, it was nicely drawn. Carmine Infantino was the most interesting artist at the time, letting Joe Kubert out because he wasn't part of the superhero stuff. But Neal came along and all of a sudden everybody started waking up. You got better work from people who had been working there for years, who had been doing just the standard, do the minimum and try and get it out. And all of a sudden they started to put backgrounds in and it was lighting. And Neal sort of stimulated everybody to take it a little bit farther. And plus he became the center of gravity in the industry itself because he would have people over to continuity and his house and all that. And he was a dynamic force. He affected everybody he encountered in some way or another. And he got the best out of them because of that, or he stimulated at least the best out of them. And that's my take on Neal on that.
Well, again, purely from the outside, I initially was just in awe, and then gradually tried to break down what it was that I thought was so good. There's certain elements of craftsmanship, there's certain cinematic effects that hadn't been in comics. There were things that you could pull apart, something like that, but in many ways, the real strength is subliminal. We can each pick bits from the surface and say, do something that looks Neal Adams-ish, but I don't think he was really so concentrating on surface. It was the underneath, the characters, the drives, the emotions, and there were so many things that, as I said previously, different artists would take one element and make an entire style out of it, but Neal could just do it all, and it would all fit together holistically. It wasn't like things stood out like a photographically copied. It fit in with something that was cartoonish. I think I heard someone say that Bill Sankovich had said that Neal could double like Charlie Brown to make him look photographically real. And I think that that's very true. You could copy a photograph and you could draw something from his head and they both look like they've been copied, or both were naturalistic. And like I say, it's so rich that lots of different people took different bits. But he could do it all.
You know, I mean, I actually saw that thing where you're talking about making Charlie Brown look realistic.
Yeah.
Neal had this, him running,
Yeah.
and what he took was the Lego Batman figure, and
Yeah.
he put it into that pose, the exact pose, nicely rendered and all that, so he could do Charlie Brown, he would have had it realistic.
You know, there was a clean style to DC's superhero books. The most visually interesting, arguably, was Carmine, who had gone back to art training in the 50s, and his level of design got elevated, which infused itself in Adam Strange and Flash. And it wasn't until Neal arrived doing covers in 67, 68, where there was a dynamism that was missing from the rest of the line. If you take a look at, I think it's one of the Superman annuals, the 80-page Giants, Kurt Swan had done a shot of Superman bursting the chains, and it looked fine because Kurt Swan was terrific. But when Neal did it for Superman 233, when then he took over as the writer, there, all of a sudden it's broad chested, the chains are bursting. There's a dynamism that was missing from the DC line. That was like the wake-up call you were talking about.
Neal never did cliches.
Yeah.
I mean, there are cliche poses that everybody uses in the business, and Neal didn't have that. If he had a hand sticking out, there was a twist to it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Can I follow up? What do we attribute that to? Training? Was it his imagination? Where did he get what made him separate from his peers?
I would say two things. One, he had a really tough mother, and she did not cut him any slack. She was like, look, you want to be an artist, you gotta make this work, or you're getting a job. So he knew he had to get out of high school and get a job because he was supporting his mother. So, because Neal grew up very, very poor, very hard life. But when he got, I will say what I feel made Neal Adams was a bit of that, and then that Ben Casey newspaper strip. When you do a newspaper strip, that is a grind. Your scripts come in, we would get the script, Neal would generally go into the bathroom and start breaking down his layouts of each daily script. Then that night, we would get the lights up with the Polaroid camera. Neal was Ben Casey, my mother was all the nurses. If there was a kid, Kris got thrown in there. And we shot all night till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning because he had to get moving the next day. And then those photos, which some of you have seen in Neal's art books, there occasionally we'll put the old Polaroids in there that we still have left as a family, and he would do his strips. We would run every Sunday night or Saturday night to the Penn Station post office, because that's the one that stayed open the latest, to get the shit out to Cleveland, Ohio. And that went on every week in the house. But I will say, every week we went and we got every newspaper there was that Ben Casey ran in, which was only sold in a Times Square newspaper stand behind what is the police station down in Times Square. And we would go home, and one of my first jobs, besides doing sticky Polaroids and playing kids, was I had to cut out every realistic newspaper strip, and I would have to lay them out. And then I would back away, because if Neal's strip did not visually look the best, you didn't want to be in the house. So he was a very competitive, looked at everything, watched everyone around him, picked up stuff. I mean, we were still buying comic books for him because he needed to know what was going on. Because if there was some guy out there who's doing something I'm not, he wanted to know what was going on. And that has always been him. So I would say it's his competitiveness, and probably because his mother told him, you gotta make this work, that made him work. That Ben Casey rooting is a lot of Neal Adams.
yeah, your dad used to tell the story about how when he was a kid, it was a tough neighborhood he lived in.
Yeah.
And he got the bullies to leave him alone because he would draw for them.
Right, he would paint their jackets. Yeah, it's true.
Neal?
So back when World Walker's Comic Art Museum was in Greenwich, Connecticut, Neal did a presentation there. And I just remember my father taking me to it, and all the kids there just sitting in rapture with him, talking about it and doing sketches. You know, some kid asked for drawing sketches, and he pulled up this Superman that he did in a minute or two, gave it to him, and he was just completely, everybody was mesmerized by everything he did.
Yeah. He was always very engaging with the fans at conventions, not just the would-be artists. I mean, when they came to the table to get autographed, it was always a conversation.
Yeah, one of the things that since Dad, everyone has come to the table with their condolences, which we're very happy for, but everybody had a story.
Mm-hmm.
And after New York Comic Con, after 3 days of hearing everyone's stories, and it was not just, comics, it was like how to run your business better, how to do the stock market, how to fix your house. I mean, it was just stories that were coming everywhere. There was like, how did he have the time between his workload and everything else to have private stories with everybody? And everyone has one, it blew me away.
And they're always kind of epic.
Yeah.
He had done a signing at a comic book shop, and he had gone to use the restroom. He came out and he goes, "Fix your toilet seat."
Right. That was his biggest gripe with retailers, is that they always have bad bathroom seats, and my dad would sit there and fix the toilet seats in every retail store he went to.
I had not known that. Sir?
Thank you for the segue, Chris. You know it's coming now. Speaking of things of like, use the word forthright, shall we say. I was in line at San Diego Con many years ago when the Batman books came out. And there was a guy in front of me who apparently owned a comic book store in Los Angeles. And he approached me and said, I'd really love to have you come to my store. And I was like, oh, great, that sounds really interesting. What did you have in mind? And even behind the guy, I could tell, deer caught in headlights.
Wait, you said yes?
Well, no, the guy had no idea beyond, I'd like to have Neal Adams cover my store. And I said, well, do you sell a lot of my stuff? Deer caught in headlights again. And you could expect Neal to dismiss him or something. Said, well, here's the deal. You're in the business to sell comic books. I'm in the business to produce comic books that people want to pay me to produce. Why don't you think about what you want to do, right? Maybe have a Neal Adams week at your store where you get merchandise in and determine what it is you want to do. And then here's my card, get a hold of me, and we'll talk about doing it. So he was actually teaching a store owner more about the fact that it's a business and how to approach their business.
Right.
Any other stories for the congregation?
Do you guys have anything about Steranko and Adams? These stories?
No, I mean, Jim and Neal don't, comic artists live in their houses usually, behind a drawing board all the time. So as much as you would think that Jim and Neal hung together, they have not. Even though I know both of them have mutual respect for one another, I will say that. I personally called Jim when my dad passed away because I knew he would take it hard, and he did. And he was like, anything you need, Chris. He was right there. But they didn't spend a lot of time together. Jim is actually one of the few that did not come for dinner. But Jim was already an established guy. Usually it was the youngsters like Mr. Starlin over there that would come through, the Adams household and onward.
His dad came in at a strange time into the business, like between generations.
Yes.
I think it was like Archie Goodwin and Denny and your dad were snuck in there
Yeah, the weird
between the
ones that got in the
1940s
doors
and the
somehow.
1970s.
So Steranko was right behind him, as far as I recall.
I think
Was it
Strange
a
was
year?
in front.
I thought it
Was
was
he?
too,
Yeah, I think Jim was ahead of Neal.
On Strange Tales? Okay,
And
But I
then
think
the
over
Irish
time,
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that was it, but,
so,
So
but they
he's
love
been
each
part of
other.
that group.
yeah, they were close, but.
They have a fun relationship with each other.
Yes, sir.
There must be a lot of sketches, at Continuity Studios and things all over the place that people haven't seen before. Is there any plan on publishing the unpublished Neal Adams?
We actually have a sketchbook out that's at our table right now, that has a lot of the commercial stuff in it. This sketchbook, Zia went in and,
We took our time with this sketchbook more so than any other sketchbook because it is a bit of a memorial. Even in picking which photo of Dad we would put in there, we agreed it has to be a picture of, like, if you're a fan and you're coming to his table, what would you see? And that photo is to us the Neal that you would see when you come to the table. But the artwork, particularly the pencils, I wanted to take special time with to make sure that the pencils looked like the pencils rather than like hard copy, high contrast Xeroxes of them. So we took extra time and care.
right,
in
and we
putting
did
this
get
together.
comic stuff to commercial stuff in it. But yes, there is, everyone is coming to me and everybody wants to do many Neal Adams books, whether it's our commercial work, his National Lampoon work, DC work, Marvel work, a lot of the artist collection, the big books that everybody wants to see out there. And with the Adams family is gonna be a little bit more open to doing a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, there are cabinets and files of just the advertising stuff,
Yeah.
not like
We
comic
have,
book stuff.
we
the
went
advertising.
from probably the corner to where I'm sitting, we have cabinets across the wall of our front room that is full, to the point where like you have to squeak little envelopes out. That's all commercial work that we have up in the studio. So yes, we will be publishing this stuff.
You got a few minutes left, any anecdotes to share?
So when I was buying comics in the 80s and 90s, I remember fondly the continuity comics, like the ones under your own name. And I particularly liked that there was like an anthology and it had a lot of European stuff in it, or at least some. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of how that brand got started and kind of how it went?
Sure, because everybody thinks we wanted to publish, which we did not. You know, Neal is innovative in this industry. So Neal was pushing for European sales royalties. And Neal was going to Europe an awful lot at this point and being invited to conventions. And he saw how Europe did comics, where they did the graphic novel and the blue lines and all that other stuff. So Neal came back from Europe and decided, you know what, I'm gonna call my guys. So he called Howard Chaykin, we got his Cody Starbuck, we had Arthur Sidem, we had Mudwogs. Neal took his Transylvania from the Peter Pan records and redid it. We had Bucky O'Hare with Michael Golden and Larry Hama. And all of that went to Europe. Neal could sell Bucky in England, he could sell Bucky in Spain, and every time we sold one, there was a nice chunky little check that would go to the creatives. And then it was bringing it back to America and then convincing, you know, Heavy Metal actually bought a number of the pieces, and then they got American money. And then everybody was like, hey, why doesn't this work at DC and Marvel? So we kind of fell into it through trying to show creatives that you can make money in all these different countries, that it can be shared, and then sell your stuff in America if you're doing your own character piece. So that's kind of how it started, and then it rolled into Pacific Comics started as a publisher, and they had just had Jack Kirby do Captain Victory, thank you. And they called also Sergio, and everybody was calling Neal, and Neal was convincing people to go ahead and do it, you know. And once again, that was another way of opening another door for creatives to be able to do their own characters, but keep their properties, because that was what Pacific Comics was offering at that time. So we started running all that the stuff we were selling overseas through Echo into Pacific Comics, because we actually started with Pacific Comics. And then they ran into trouble, and then we took over, because we had all this material, it forced us into publishing. So that's kind of the story of how we got there. It always comes from Neal trying to make something better in the industry. And then we will then catch up to it another way. But it's always the forefront is to convince something to get better.
I was working with Rafa Medoff and Stephen Tepp, attorney Stephen Tepp, in recent years, and continue to on the very difficult advocacy thing for Dina Babbitt and her heirs. I just was in touch with Stephen again. We were back and forth the last couple of months about the latest pieces on that. In terms of advocacy like that case, and I won't go into that further, will you all be still involved in some way? Will you still be carrying on? It just continues to seem like an uphill battle, but one of the things that Neal was very clear on was that push, never stop pushing.
Right.
And so Stephen Tepp and I are still very much trying to figure out new ways to push.
Right. I will say that I was very young for the Academy. I was the treasurer of the Comic Book Creators Guild, which started in the front room of continuity as usual. I have done a lot of the Dina Babbitt work. I am always under Neal. Somewhere there is always Kris. DC will say Kris has negotiated and she's a hard ass in doing contracts and stuff like that. We did our finalizations with DC and Marvel before Neal passed away. That was one of the things that Neal and I got done early and out of the way. And we have a great relationship with both companies at this point. And yes, that's the stuff I love to do. And yes, Dina Babbitt is still a continuity, and, you know, we're there to fight it, for sure.
I'll still get in touch.
Okay,
So
definitely.
we're about out of time, but you know, we've only scratched the surface of Neal's influence and the stories about Neal in so many different ways. Obviously, readers are better off for Neal's work and advocacy. Publishers are better off. That's a pretty good legacy to leave behind, and his influence is going to be felt for a generation or two to go.
And we have some new work coming out.
Oh yeah.
Continuity Publishing, or the comics, died because we financed it out of a little art studio. We did not have a mega company that financed us. So when the market dipped, we had to step out of it. But Neal, we were in the middle of a Rise of Magic crossover, and basically we have continued that during all this downtime. Neal finished it. All that is left is to do coloring of it. So our plan is to actually get that out. That is my I need to get this out. It's gotta get out there. So that is gonna be a goal that we're shooting for, to either kickstart it or we'll figure out a way to get it out. And that'll be coming out. And that's actually new work. But our plan is to keep Neal out there. Our plan is to still be part of the industry. My plan may be to rep artists, which God forbid that happens in the industry, because then it will get better, I promise you.
Thank you for being here today. Yeah, I know. Chris wants a picture of everybody.